Right, then let's come back to the African continent. Trade ministers from around Africa are meeting in Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo, to discuss the Trump administration's controversial tariff policies. Now, earlier this month, Washington imposed a new 10% baseline tariff, they called it, on imports from virtually all African countries. But some states, like Lesotho, were hit by a much higher rate, 50% in the case of that landlocked southern African country. Now, a 90-day pause was announced some hours later, but the original decree to begin with was enough to concern many an African government, especially those that have become reliant on AGOA. That's the African Growth and Opportunity Act. For 2 decades, that law has provided duty-free access for exporters to the United States market. Organizers say that this Kinshasa meeting is looking to strategize on how to mitigate the effects of these tariffs once that 90-day break is over. The Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Mene, has described the tariffs as a wake-up call for the continent. He is now urging African countries to accelerate their efforts towards economic self-sufficiency and more regional integration. Now, between them, the European Union, China and India, they accounted for at least half of Africa's two-way trade flows in 2023. So given the comparatively smaller share of trade with the United States, does that then imply that African economies are less vulnerable to the policy uncertainty unleashed by this White House? That's why I started my conversation with Dr. Daouda Sembene, an economist and the founder of the advisory firm AfriCatalyst.
Last year, for instance, Africa's total export were about $682 billion, and it's the share of export from African countries to the U.S. was about $40 billion. So basically, you're talking about less than 6%. If you look at it that way, it may not be very significant. But if you look at it from a country perspective, from those countries that, sort of export quite a sizable volume of goods to the U.S., then that is very much significant. And for those countries, I guess any tariff change or the new U.S. Trade policy might really very much have very damaging impact on their ability to remain competitive, but also to sort of stimulate their economic activities.
And we will be talking about one of those countries, South Africa, in just a moment. But I want to jump on some comments from the U.S. Trade Representative when he was speaking to Congress. And he says, we're talking with the Kenyan authorities on setting up a new free trade agreement, right, between the two countries. And that seems to be the sort of template that this administration is going for, bilateral trade deals with individual African countries. But assuming that that is the case that they will go with, right, as a way of replacing AGOA, how should Kenyan policymakers be thinking about A, how to protect their own nascent manufacturing, but also B, to also not have negative spillover effects into their trade within the regional trade blocs like COMESA or the East African Community?
Well, Kenya, like 53 other African countries, have made commitment under the African Continental Free Trade Area to sort of work together to set up a common market. I think that came with a number of commitments in terms of how they should go about the trade relationship with other non-African countries, also how they should go about removing trade barriers within African countries, non-trade barriers within African countries. So definitely, I think it is certainly in African interest that under the African Union umbrella, Kenya and all other African countries set together, sort of negotiate with the U.S. to get the best deal for Africa, not for individual countries. That being said, if a country like Kenya is being invited to actually have bilateral trade agreement with the U.S., I would assume that it's very hard for them to refuse that invitation. But what would really matter is to make sure that any agreement that they would have with the U.S. continue to be in line with their commitment and their the requirements of the CFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area. I think this is extremely critical to make sure that whatever country actually agree with the U.S. on a bilateral basis, not just the U.S., but with any other non-African countries, whatever they agree on a bilateral basis is very much something that is fully in line with their commitment under the free trade area of Africa. I think that would be critical.
Just pulling back from a global perspective, given all the turmoil that we're seeing at the moment and all the trade barriers coming up, how concerned should these trade ministers be about the possibility of seeing goods being dumped into their market, especially this year?
Look, I think this is very much a legitimate concerns, and I believe, as I said earlier, it is quite urgent at this stage that under the umbrella of the African Union, trade ministers throughout Africa sort of convene as soon as possible, first of all, to very much understand the impact of the current situation, starting with the US tariffs, but also the current geopolitical context, to see how that might impact their Africa as a whole and their countries individually, and then sort of agree and strategize about how best to collectively respond to this new deal and this new reality.
Let's focus on one of the countries that's likely to be hard hit, right, by these specific round of tariffs. South Africa had a near $9 billion trade deficit with the United States, and they export a broad range of things, right? So it's wine from those lovely vineyards down in Cape Town, it's vehicles from Port Elizabeth, it's chrome, it's iron ore, it's aluminium and steel and so on and so forth into the US. So assuming for the sake of argument, AGOA is basically dead, and these tariffs do get reimposed again at that rate of 30-something%, 90 days from now, how does that affect the competitiveness of South African exports?
Well, I mean, South Africa is one of those African countries that have a huge exposure to the U.S. market. It is one of those countries where the size of the export to the U.S. compared to the total imports is quite significant. And when I say significant, I'm talking about cases where it might be more than 5%. So I think it means that, of course, if the U.S. was to sort of rescind this 90-day suspension for the reciprocal tariffs, that would very much have some potentially some significant impact on the ability of South Africa to maintain its competitiveness.